As the fallout over the explosion in the Oval Office from last Friday continues to resonate, everybody's trying to figure out what's going to happen with the peace process, with Volodymyr Zelensky. What is Europe going to do? Things are starting to come into a little bit more clarity now. And one of the key things is that the United States is going to conflict resolution with or without Volodymyr Zelensky. And to try and unpack some of that and to try and see if we're on the right path or not, we have back the always popular Col Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat vet, and a big friend of the show. Doug, welcome back.
Happy to be here.
A lot of things to discuss here. And by the way, we're also going to be joined in front of the camera again by Gary Villapiano. The fan favorite starting to be already. We did a show this past weekend where Gary was on. It had a lot of positive reactions. So we're going to start doing that more because we got a lot of good dynamics.
Well, that's just because they don't know Gary. Come on.
Or maybe because they know him really well, because he had a lot of good stuff.
We talked about this.
Remember, he has a vowel on the end of his name. Immediately suspicious.
But we can't do anything about that. But he's always got great stuff to say. But let's jump right into this issue here, Doug, because initially after this happened, really the reaction to the issue itself when it happened in the Oval Office on Friday was kind of cleaved into two already existing camps. If you didn't like Trump before, you said, oh my God, what a horrible thing he did. And of course that happened all over Europe. Or if you already liked Trump, you said, yeah, it's about time, etc. Those things are starting to play out even more so. But I think that what we've seen from Europe in the days since that time is starting to, I think, clear out that Europe is moving a little closer into the Trump camp than they were before. And part of the reason for that is I think that the reality is starting to set in, not the least of which was by Treasury Secretary Mr. Bissett.
It is impossible to have an economic deal without a peace deal. The sine qua non for an economic deal is that Ukrainian leadership wants a peace deal. We were already set up to sign the deal. So it's unclear now. President Zelensky has thrown off the sequencing. And I think we have to see if President Zelensky wants to proceed. What's the use in having an economic agreement that's going to be rendered moot if he wants the fighting to continue? President Trump wants a peace deal.
Now, that's one thing that has really stood out to me since then, especially in the previous administration. Every time there was heat, you almost always saw the White House walk back something that had been said. In this case, everybody's staying on the same sheet of music. How do you see the issue of that whole escapade on Friday?
Well, the Treasury Secretary is stating the obvious that needs to be understood by everyone, and that is that capital always flees areas of crisis and conflict. So he's right. Putting this economic agreement out there at this point is putting the horse way out in front of the cart. That's number one. Number two, I don't know who set up this meeting, but if I were the president, I would replace them, simply because meetings like this between heads of state, particularly in a contentious environment, have to be harmonious gatherings. In other words, you meet with someone in the Oval Office to discuss something, and then you expect that there will be some sort of outcome, some agreement. If there's not going to be an agreement and the sides are that widely apart, then there's no reason under any circumstances for anything to happen in the Oval Office. So I'm a little astonished that this was allowed to happen at all. And I think the third point is that Vice President Vance is right. He had spoken at the Munich Security Council or conference and made the point that the leaders in Europe, the leadership class, this globalist leadership class, is out of touch with their own population. The populations in Europe overwhelmingly are opposed to war with Russia. That includes Poland, Germany, France. No one supports the idea of sending thousands of troops to Ukraine to fight the Russians. So it's a little ludicrous and stupid for them to take this position. So you put it all together, President Trump is leading in the right direction, but he needs to make sure that something this ridiculous never happens again in the Oval Office.
Well, I'll tell you, Doug, there's growing evidence that there was a plan in place that the Ukraine side had agreed to, that they were just going to sign the minerals deal, and none of the other stuff was supposed to even be on the agenda. And then Zelensky inserted it in there. And I think there's some justifications to suggest that he sabotaged this on purpose because he doesn't want to move in the direction of peace. What do you think?
I think Zelensky is a clown and a criminal. I've thought this from the beginning. I was watching this morning as our old friend Stuart Varney. You'll recall that when Varney found out, he asked me about Zelensky, and I said Zelensky was hardly an heroic figure. He was presiding over a disaster. I was summarily dismissed from the Fox Business channel, never to return. We now know that that's utter nonsense. This man, Zelensky, does not represent the interests of the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people want an end to this conflict. I don't care what they say the polls are telling them. I don't believe the pollsters. I think the Ukrainian people have absolutely had enough of it. So the question at this stage is, we want peace, then how do we get to a settlement? And that's really what President Trump was trying to say to him. But the idea that we should have any economic agreement in place ahead of time is just irrational. And Besament is spot on. First, you've got to have peace. You've got to have an end to the fighting. Then you can talk about economic recovery and economic cooperation.
Doug, do you think that the Trump administration was overly confident that Zelensky actually was going to sit down and acquiesce when he came on Friday?
Obviously, he was. And I think that's because the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, intimated that to President Trump. Why else would President Trump have agreed to meet with this man in the Oval Office? He had the vice president there, the Secretary of State. And I think the expectation was that, yes, we've agreed to an end to the conflict. We're going to work out the details. And once those are worked out, we will move forward with many forms of economic cooperation. Thank you very much, President Trump, for meeting with me. End of discussion. That's what was supposed to happen. Obviously, it didn't. But remember that Zelensky also went to a briefing that included people like Kellogg and Lindsey Graham and other well-known neocons who I think probably encouraged him to be ridiculous. And I thought it was interesting that within an hour or so of the meeting, Lindsey Graham was running around to distance himself from the disaster. But I rather suspect that Lindsey Graham and General Kellogg both had a hand in the disaster. I think they helped to concoct it. I can't prove it, but that's my suspicion. Why else would this man walk into the Oval Office and be as stridently insulting as he was? And plus the fact, somebody needs to tell this man, if you're going to go to the White House, for God's sakes, put on a suit and a tie.
I knew you were going
running around in costume.
Right. I don't know if you saw it, Doug, but in the earlier part of that it was about 45-minute total period of time. Early in there, some of the reporters were asking and really kind of dinging him hard on the fact that he wasn't in a suit, and he just kept on going with it. But he didn't seem to get the message.
Well, he shouldn't have been allowed in the building. You go back, put a suit and tie on. We'll talk to you. Until then, get out.
Yeah, you're not John Fetterman.
We need to be. These things need to be black and white. I know President Trump. Look at President Trump. He's always handsomely dressed. So are the people that work in his immediate area. So this is nonsense. He just needs to make that rule clear and concise. No more clown shows in clown uniforms. This needs to go away.
Well, I think it's going to now. But now the United States seems intent that they're going to move with or without Zelensky. In fact, you speaking to Mark Rubio on the television shows yesterday, he wanted and said, hey, look, we're going straight to Russia if we need to.
What are the Russians' demands? Under what conditions would the Russians be willing to stop this war? And as I said, we don't know what those are because we haven't talked to them in 3 years. That's the singular goal here, is to try to bring about an end to this conflict, and it begins by getting them to the table.
But his comment there that we don't know what the Russians want, I think it is pretty clear what the Russians want. What is your view on what the Russians want?
Oh, absolutely. I think the Russians have made it abundantly clear what they want. They've talked about the so-called breakaway provinces, the territories that they hold. There will be no discussion about the legitimate control of those or Crimea. They've also said that they're not going to agree to a ceasefire until they're sure that the denazification of Ukraine is going to go to completion, until Ukrainian arms are completely defeated. We know these things. So I don't think we have to have a meeting with them to figure it out. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, why are we not stopping the delivery of military aid and assistance to Zelensky? That's what's keeping him alive. That's his lifeline. That's the cash that he stuffs into his bank accounts and the bank accounts of his cronies that are helping to rule and ultimately destroy Ukraine. That's what keeps the generals happy and the colonels in the army, and why they continue to send their men out to die pointlessly. They're all handsomely paid. Why not stop that right now? That's the first thing. And then turn around and say, everybody who's an American citizen, get out, leave. Then President Trump can decide who he wants to send back in at some point. But right now, everybody who is there is a legacy of the past, a legacy of the last administration, a legacy of the wrong policy. Get them out. Then I think you can get somewhere with the Russians.
Why do you think Trump is hesitant to do that?
I don't know. I wish I had an answer. I've been saying these things for weeks, as you know, Dan. And I think he's dealing with advisors who live in a fantasy world. You know, Washington is half Disney World and half Epstein Island. And I think everybody lives on it, and they're out of touch with reality. I think President Trump has a realistic grasp now. He knows that the Russians have won. He knows the power that they have over the situation, and he wants an end to this, and he wants good relations with Russia. Hallelujah. Thank God. It's about time. But I don't think anyone has helped him with a roadmap to get there. And, you know, I don't know what you can do at this point other than hope that these things will happen and we can get going.
You have to think they have those conversations. My goodness, that they haven't arrived. Like you said, he doesn't have a roadmap at this point to do that.
You know, I don't know what kinds of conversations occur, and I don't know who sits in on them, and I don't know to what degree the president listens to them. You know, President Trump has always had good instincts. I've said this forever. Yeah. Follow his instincts, he'll be successful. The problem is he's always got a lot of people around him derailing him. And that's what happened during the last administration. This has been a much more successful beginning this time around, and that's great. But he's got to follow it up with decisive action. And you know, action means end the aid, get the Americans out.
I think that some of the other ones that we don't have the sound in front of us right here, but some of the other ones I think are moving in that direction. For example, Carolyn Levitt said over the weekend that, hey, this is not the Biden administration anymore. That blank check, we're done with that. So they seem to be moving in the direction that you're suggesting.
Well, yeah, but unless you absolutely end the military aid to the Ukrainian state at this stage, whatever it is, it's not taken seriously. The Russians have heard lots of talk. We've lied to them prolifically for years about everything. The Russians are about action. When you listen to Lavrov, Putin, the others, they want to see evidence for action. The action is all aid stops immediately. Number one. Number two, Americans, we are leaving. We're out. For our purposes, we have nothing more to do with this Ukrainian state, which is the epitome of corruption and incompetence.
You know, one of the other things, back to the Rubio thing, that is also moving in the right direction, is that he seems to understand that that we're not going to give any kind of security guarantees, which is what Zelensky continues even today to ask for, looking for American backstop, etc. But the Europeans seem to be saying, hey, we're not going anywhere unless we have that backstop. But then Rubio said, here's what his views are on security guarantees.
The security guarantees, which I actually like to call deterrence, is all contingent upon there being a peace. Everybody's saying security guarantees to secure the peace. You first have to have a peace. We don't even know if the peace is possible. And this was understood by the Ukrainians. It was explained to them repeatedly. And that is, here's our strategy. We're trying to get Putin to a negotiating table. Let's not everyone knows the history here, the back and forth. We understand that. But the question now is, can we get them to a table to negotiate? That's our goal. Don't do anything to disrupt that. And that's what Zelensky did, unfortunately.
So obviously Zelensky doesn't want the negotiation because he doesn't want the war to end. I think that should be clear by now. But the only thing about that I would just pick a little bit with the Secretary of State there is they say we're trying to get Russia to the negotiating table. Russia wants to come to the negotiating table. We don't have to drag them there. We just, as you just said, have to be willing to take action based on it.
Yeah, I think Secretary Rubio has spent so much time on the other side of this fight, the fight for stupidity and misguided policy, that it's hard for him to adjust. The Russians are already sitting at the table. They've made very clear what their conditions are to negotiate an end to this disaster. So let's drop that nonsense. We know that. We need to take action that supports the conditions that they've asked for. And there's nothing unreasonable or irrational about those conditions. We should be celebrating the fact that the Russians want to stop this at all and be very glad that they want to have a neutral Ukraine. Remember, we talked years ago, Dan, that Ukraine's principal mission in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet state system was to be this large neutral state that separated us from Russia. That was in the interest of Russia. We thought it was in the interest of NATO. Suddenly that was overturned and we launched into this madness. We need to get back to thinking in those terms. And we need to talk about what a future treaty would entail. And that's why we go back to the Austrian State Treaty. And by the way, the security guarantees in the Austrian State Treaty had nothing to do with deterrence. They had everything to do with guaranteeing freedom, rights, position, all of these things within Austria that was acceptable to both sides. And that's what we should be interested in. What do we collectively want Ukraine to be able to pursue? Obviously, that's prosperity and freedom. That can be done. So let's get back to basics. Stop playing these propaganda games and jockeying for position.
And Doug, let me ask you something.
Let's get going.
One of the devil's advocate thing that people say was, you can't trust Russia. If you do something like that, well, like the Austrian state, it'll just egg them on, and then they'll rearm, and then 5 years from now, they'll come back and take the rest of Ukraine. That's what I hear a lot. What do you say to that?
Well, look at Finland. Finland went through a terrible war. They fought bravely and killed large numbers of Russians, about 250,000, against 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 Finns. And the Russians did not want to fight their way to Helsinki. They wanted an end to the conflict. They ended up taking territory from Finland, but then they established a treaty, and that treaty guaranteed Finnish existence, independence, and neutrality. There has never been an incident since then. In other words, since 1945, after the Second World War, the Finns and the Russians have done land office business economically and have gotten along without any threats to Finland and its territorial integrity. I think we can trust the Russians in that sense. The question is, can the Russians trust us? Because we have a bad habit of backpedaling, misinterpreting. They go back to the Budapest Memorandum. They go back to the Minsk Accords. They watched as 14,000 Russians were killed in Donetsk and Luhansk during the interim between 2014 and 2022. And so they asked themselves, can we trust the West? I think that's the more important question. I think, yes, President Trump can be trusted, but we've got to demonstrate that we are fundamentally different from the last bunch that was in power.
And speaking of the last bunch that was in power and how that's viewed on the Russian side, Sergei Lavrov yesterday was asked some of the questions about the fallout from the Oval Office disaster and how the next day Zelensky goes to Europe. He was feted in London, et cetera. And so he was asked, between Europe and the United States, who can you work with?
Роли. И сейчас, после вот этого срока Байдена, пришли люди, которые хотят руководствоваться здравым смыслом, которые прямо говорят, мы хотим закончить все войны, хотим мира. А кто сейчас требует продолжения банкета в виде войны? Европа. Вот сейчас мы про миротворцев, мы готовим столько-то тысяч, мы будем обеспечивать прикрытие с воздуха этих миротворцев. Но это тоже наглость, потому что, во-первых, нас никто не спрашивает, а Трамп все понимает. Трамп сказал, что сейчас рано говорить, когда будет урегулирование. Этот вопрос можете обсуждать, но нужно будет согласие сторон.
Now, he went on in that interview to say that he really feels like that they can make a deal with Trump. They said that they agree with him. They like some of the things that he's doing, and they feel that they can trust him. We'll see if that continues on there. But he was contrasting that with, he said, the Europeans, they're talking about peacekeepers. They're talking about security guarantees, British planes potentially. And he said, but nobody's even talking to us. And I think that really highlights what the difference is between the Trump administration and everybody else in the West, certainly the previous administration who talked to nobody in Russia. At least we're moving in the right direction in that.
Well, the Starmer government in London, which is probably the leading contender for the stupidity award right now regarding Russia, has one foot in the grave. All right. I don't know how much longer Starmer is going to be there. And if you look at Paris, that place is at a boil. It's only a question of when it boils over, and Macron and a lot of other people may be gone. The Russians aren't fools. They know that. I think the Russians will exercise patience. And if the British and the French try to take, the whole British army, which is roughly 75,000, and the whole French army, which is 120,000, and move it all to Western Ukraine, I don't think the French population or the British population will tolerate it. Remember, the Poles, so this is Donald Tusk, who's not exactly a opponent of globalism, in Poland has already said the Poles will contribute nothing, no troops to anything in Western Ukraine. So if you can't get the Poles that have served effectively as a logistical forward operating base for NATO to join this, who are the British and the French kidding? They're kidding themselves, and they're making fools out of themselves.
Doug, did you see Starmer over the weekend by chance?
No, I have never met Starmer. I will not meet Starmer, and I was not invited. No. What?
No, the reason why I ask is if you saw him, the way he was carrying himself, he certainly, he seems to think he's the new leader of the free world.
Well, you have a series of British prime ministers who have all competed for the Churchill Award. In one way or another, they're always trying to sound like or behave like Churchill. And unfortunately, they forgot to point out that Churchill bankrupted Great Britain, reduced it to a second-rate power, and lost the British Empire. They better wake up. The future is not the past. And they've got to chart a new course, and they've got to listen to their own people. Exactly what Vice President Vance said. They're not listening to the people in England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And the French leadership are not listening to the Frenchmen on the ground in France. It has to stop. And I think the Germans have begun to figure it out. It'll take a little longer, but eventually they'll get there. But this man, Merz, is beginning to change his tune, thank goodness. But it may not be enough. He may only be there for 6 months or 8 months, and then you'll finally get a government that just tells the truth. We have to end this nonsense with NATO, and I think they will, because they know that they need Russian energy, and the Russians are quite anxious to do business with the Germans, which is an old relationship. We don't need to see that as a danger to us, because it isn't. But, these things take time. I think the Russians will exercise patience.
Doug, you mentioned time. I think it was really telling. We often talk about how, honestly, a lot behind all of this war and the continuation is about money. And Starmer, in his announcement with Zelensky, they're talking about this new, I think it was a 1.6 billion pound deal to make 5,000 air defense missiles. And everybody's like, yay, that sounds wonderful. Well, when you look into the details, turns out that this deal is an expansion of one that they did in last September 24. The first batch of that deal will come in probably December of this year. The rest of these will go between 2027 and 2030. So I know it's going to create all these jobs in the UK, et cetera, but it's going to have nothing to do with the war. The best case is that maybe a year, if the Ukraine still survives, they'll get the first batch of them, which won't have any impact on the fighting anyway.
I think the word for it is fugazi. You know, for those who've seen The Wolf on Wall Street, it's just fugazi. That's what these people are preaching and peddling, so forget it. The other thing is, I was coming in here, I was handed a note by the boss, and he said, we've calculated that to fund the war in Ukraine, every family in America, every tax-paying citizen in America has to fork over $2,400 every year to the federal government. That's just Ukrainian aid. We haven't talked about the Middle East. We haven't talked about the wasteful spending on the Taiwan business. We haven't talked about any of that. Just think about that. If every taxpayer had to pay $2,400 every year to fund our support for Ukraine or the proxy war in Ukraine, how long would it last? Not long.
Yeah, Doug, I wouldn't spend $24, much less $2,400, and I bet there's not many other Americans that would do that as well.
Just imagine in Great Britain right now, where you have a lot of people that are living just above the poverty line that could crash right through and end up in poverty, especially if their treasury market, they call them gilts, collapses. It almost collapsed under Liz Truss. That's one of the reasons she was ushered out of the room. And she was talking about Thatcherism, which makes no sense and is totally irrelevant to Great Britain today. Well, Starmer is even more irrelevant and more deluded than Liz Truss ever was. So this Fugazi is going nowhere. And I'm sure the Russians understand that. We just need to move on down the road. President Trump needs to move forward, and the rest eventually will get on board. Of that, I have little doubt.
And Doug, I want to go back to something you said at the first part of this episode here. You were talking about, you referred to J.D. Vance's comment and speech before the Munich Security Conference, where he was saying some things that made a lot of the Europeans not just uncomfortable, but kind of angry. Well, yesterday, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard went on U.S. television and picked up the theme.
I think those who are criticizing his efforts are showing that they are not committed to peace. And in the case of many of those European countries, that they're not committed to the cause and values of freedom. Even though they speak of this, we heard very clearly during Vice President Vance's speech in Munich, different examples of how these European partners and longtime allies in many cases are actually implementing policies that undermine democracy, that shows that they don't actually believe in the voices of the people being heard, and implementing anti-freedom policies. We're seeing this in the United Kingdom. We're seeing this in Germany. We saw it with the tossing out of the elections in Romania. So there's something fundamentally deeper here that shows a huge difference in divergence between the values that President Trump and Vice President Vance are fighting for. Basically, that they are going to support him in continuing this war, and that they don't stand with us around these fundamental values of freedom.
Is she right, Doug? Is there a big dispatch?
Well, there are two things that the Director of National Intelligence is making very clear. The first is that we're listening to the Fugazi perpetrators or peddlers. They don't have any skin in the game. They're talking as though they have vast forces at their disposal that they can readily hurl into action against the Russians in Ukraine. They don't. All they want to do is send cash. And by the way, it's cash they don't have. It's cash that they have to create from nothing. So this is the problem with central banking. Central banking and waging war go hand in hand. As long as you have a central bank that can create money from nothing, you're going to continue to see these wars. And that certainly is true in Great Britain, and I would argue everywhere. So she's absolutely right on that point. The second part is, free speech. What's free speech? Well, free speech too often turns out to be something that the people in power can tolerate, not necessarily what everybody thinks. And the right of free expression simply doesn't exist right now. It's curtailed here. I hope it improves. But there's a lot of censorship, as you know. There are protected classes, things you can't say. This is all nonsense. It needs to go away. And I think President Trump has made it clear he wants to head in that direction. But the Europeans, at least the globalist leaders that we're dealing with right now, they're not on board with that. They've got to go away too.
Yep, they do, or else we're just going to go our way. And I think that a lot of the comments coming out of Europe today, after a lot of the things that happened over the weekend, and a lot of glad handing with Zelensky, taking him to see the king and all this kind of stuff. But when it comes down to it, they're not going to just go into Ukraine with their troops without the backstop of the United States. What do you think will happen once, if Trump sticks to his guns, doesn't backstop anything? How will the Europeans backtrack on this, backpedal?
Well, I think the 1956 Suez Crisis is probably instructive. The British and the French went ahead with their invasion. The Israelis joined them, marched into the Suez or the Sinai, and everybody's objective was to gain control of the Suez Canal, which again, I guess, is on Mr. Netanyahu's agenda. And what happened when President Eisenhower said no thanks? He pulled the rug out from under everyone. And the French and the British said, oh, that's it. I guess we can't afford this. We can't sustain ourselves without American military support and assistance and cash. We're leaving. And the Israelis were politely told by Eisenhower to go home and get out of the Sinai. So I think that's what would happen, Dan. Just look at the 56 Suez Crisis, and that would happen if they dared to do something incredibly stupid in Western Ukraine.
Well, let's hope that certainly doesn't happen. I'm going to have to pull a bit of an audible here. I'm going to have to take off and hand the reins over to Gary to continue on here. And by the way, I will have an announcement to make regarding this channel coming up here in a couple of days. But I'll hold off on that for now until some things are happening behind the scenes. But I do want to thank everybody for being with us today. And Gary, if you can just pick it up and carry it on home from here.
Of course, of course.
Okay, Dan.
Doug, we've said a lot about Zelensky. I just want to play one thing that was particularly alarming to me, and this is an interview he did after the White House meeting, and he was on with Fox News, and this is what he had to say.
So the question today is, can Ukraine win this war or hold off Russia without continued U.S. support?
It will be difficult for us. That's why I'm here. That's why we speak about the future negotiations. It will be difficult without your support, but we can't lose our values, our people. We can't lose our freedom.
Doug, he only says it will be difficult. That concerns me so much that is his mindset. He's going to go on. He will proceed on. He wants to strengthen Ukraine. They cannot lose, he says. He keeps repeating this. He is so determined after all that's gone on. He has not changed his constitution, his inner constitution.
Well, Gary, he was picked to play a role. And he wants to go down with the ship, so to say. He wants to present himself as an heroic figure, defending Ukrainian nationalism and the Ukrainian national state, and be recorded as such in history. It's nonsense. This war is over. He knows it. And the promises that the British and the French are making, as Dan pointed out, are meaningless nonsense, fugazi. So the real issue today is, when will someone stand up and say, thank you, Mr. Zelensky, for your interest in Ukraine's national defense. Goodbye. I think that's coming.
You know, Doug, I'm afraid that's further down the road than I'm comfortable with, and I know you're comfortable with it. Is that you saw just recently he spoke to the European Union. It wasn't even 2 weeks ago. He's got standing ovations, applauding him, loving him, showering him with affection and admiration. You can imagine the Constitution I was just talking about that he's so convinced of. It's not, that's why it's not going away, Doug. I think he gets he gets so encouraged everywhere he turns. The one slap down finally in the Oval Office he's gotten, but then where did he go? He ran over to 10 Downing Street and had the warm embrace. I think he's got enough of that on the other side of the other angel talking to him, saying, "Don't give up now, young man."
Mm-hmm. Well, look, the EU Parliament is by no means universally behind him. And there are lots of members that did not applaud and did not clap. So I would be careful to assume that there's some sort of groundswell of support in Europe. No, the globalist elites have decided that if they admit that they were wrong, if they admit that they've lied, that the narrative that they embraced and spun out from the very beginning was false, then they're afraid of the anger and the resentment that will awaken in their own electorates. The truth is, it's going to happen anyway. They might as well tell the truth and move out because they're going to be thrown out of office. So I wouldn't put too much store in all the love and kisses that Mr. Zelensky is receiving at this point. We've been down this road before with others. It's not going to work out well for him.
Just to guess on your part, if you don't mind me asking for your conjecture, does he stay in office throughout these next few weeks, months?
I don't think so. I think he's going to be hounded from office. No one knows with certainty how that happens, but there's no future for the man. And what he's done is essentially told the Russians, march further. Come on, seize everything up to the Dnieper River, and then potentially daring them to cross into Kiev, which the Russians don't want to do because Kiev is a city that is virtually holy to the Russians. It's the birthplace of Orthodox Christianity in Russia. They don't want to do any damage there. But if they're pushed, yes, they can, and they will. But I rather suspect that cooler minds will prevail in the West, and arrangements will be made for Mr. Zelensky to leave. That's my assumption. We'll see.
Doug, you released a video over the weekend about something that's heavy on your heart, and we'll make it available. We'll put the link in the description here. But would you just briefly tell us what your urgent call was? A call to action, actually, to the American people as to what you see that's turbulent right now that we need to be paying attention to.
Well, thanks to President Trump's courageous leadership, I think we're seeing peace gradually return to Europe. And I think we've seen the beginning of the end of this insane and stupid and unnecessary war in Ukraine. But the situation in the Middle East is very different. And we are heavily involved there in bankrolling and underwriting this terrible war of mass expulsion and killing in Gaza, which I expect will resume shortly. That war now has a chance of blowing up. Netanyahu has now cut off all food, water, sustenance to the population in Gaza. And all of the Arab states are meeting tomorrow in Cairo to address the Gaza problem and put together a plan, which they've already got right now. They'll vote on that. That will be submitted to Israel, and it will be effectively an ultimatum. Either you accept this or we will be at war with you. And I think the Israelis are betting that the Arabs, being historically feckless, disorganized, and ill-led, will amount to nothing. I think they're wrong, and I think they're going to be surprised because not only will the Arab states ultimately direct their aggression against Israel once and for all, I think it will also be Iran and Turkey. I think the entire Muslim world will eventually come online against Israel. So that's disastrous because nothing good can come of that for us. It's certainly not good for us as a great power, destroys our reputation, certainly in the Middle East, ruins our position as a future business partner, negotiator, and of course it could lead to the demise of Israel, something which the Israelis apparently think is impossible. I do not. So the bottom line is I made an appeal to Americans to understand that this is the wrong war in the wrong place for all the wrong reasons, and that we should intervene to stop it. And if we don't, we'll pay a terrible price. And I'd rather that we didn't. I'd rather that we not waste any more blood and treasure in the Middle East. And I think most Americans feel that way. And I want them to call their senators, their representatives, congressmen, everyone, and make it clear that this is not something they want. Because we've seen in the past that when Americans speak with one voice very loudly, Congress actually listens, because at the end of the day, Congress may not care much for most Americans, but they do want to stay in office. And when Americans raise their voices, they pay attention because they want to be there in the future. So hopefully this will have an impact. And I'll make sure that you get a copy of it without the music behind it, so that it can be more freely posted and passed around.
Yeah,
Okay?
Yeah, for sure. Hey,
Thanks,
Doug,
Gary. I appreciate it. I got to run now, too.
Beautiful, no problem, Doug. All right, I'm going to tell people about your new show coming up on Republic.us starting in the next couple of weeks.
We're still working on the pilot, and we're taking our time. We want this to be very good. I think it'll be entertaining as well as interesting, but no wine before it's time. So this is going to take a little longer to get right, and we want it to be right before we go forward. So I would say nothing before the end of March and the beginning of April.
Beautiful.
Okay.
All right. Yep. We'll keep our eye on it. Doug, thank you so much.
Very
We love
much.
having your insight, brother. All right. Talk to you soon.
All the best.
Everybody, thanks so much for stopping by. You know how much we appreciate you. Like and subscribe. Unintimidated, uncompromised. We'll see you at 2 o'clock. We're going to have Steve Jeremy on, and he is going to talk about, there we go, the EU's pipe dream for Ukraine. Steve is a former UK Commodore. He's a great guy, and you guys have seen him before, and I think you're going to like him this time too today. So we'll see you at 2 o'clock for Steve Jeremy.